So the overall assessment, I think, is fairly clear, and here I agree with the Pentagon report, that the trend lines, unfortunately, for Taiwan are moving in the PRC direction. Taiwan is now much more vulnerable, I would argue, than they were 30 years ago or even 10 years ago. And the United States and its forces are confronting an increasingly lethal environment close into China, close enough in to actually conduct the kind of defensive missions that the U.S. foresees in that kind of a situation. So we're faced with a situation where on the one side you have this perverse outcome where the PLA capability and its perception that it actually has the upper hand and the trend lines are moving in their direction in military modernization potentially gives the civilian leadership more comfort and confidence in pursuing cross-strait rapprochement. In other words, they feel more backstop. At the same time, the continuing threat and the lack of credible confidence-building measures with the island creates levels of domestic turbulence in Taiwanese domestic politics that make cross-strait rapprochement more difficult. In other words, can you really, I don't want to get philosophical here, but can you really consent at the point of a gun? It's certainly a difficult issue. The third and final thing I'd like to discuss this afternoon is, in particular, moving forward, the relationship of the TRA to the issue of the defense of Taiwan. Clearly, the TRA has been critical to the defense of Taiwan, both for Taiwan proper as well in the context of potential coalition warfare with U.S. and Taiwan trying to repel a PRC attack. And the TRA has clearly raised the bar for the Chinese leadership in terms of how they would define success and how much capability they would need in order to achieve success. And to emphasize that point, simply consider the converse. Consider the assessment of the military balance by the leadership in Beijing in the absence of the Taiwan Relations Act, in the absence of any language talking about U.S. interests in a peaceful resolution of the Taiwan scenario, any language about the possibility of U.S. arms sales in response to new Chinese offensive capabilities. Imagine a world in which there was not that language, particularly given the way the center of gravity has shifted in Sino-U.S. relations, our burgeoning trade relationship, all the other reasons potentially to shift from our historic relationship with Taiwan. But clearly mistakes have been made, but perhaps in the spirit of the Reagan administration, mistakes were made so that no one in particular can be blamed. At my organization, we believe in vigorous criticism and self-criticism as a management tool, and I think we shouldn't fear criticism and self-criticism in this context. I would argue that the implementation of the TRA by the U.S. side over the last 30 years has not been consistent. It has been deeply affected by politics, and I can understand the frustration on all sides who want a certain perfect symmetry in the world to be frustrated by the vagaries and weaknesses of the human spirit. But there it is. Similarly, Taiwan's defense requests have not always been derived, I would argue have rarely been derived from a comprehensive defense strategy, and instead often reflect maddening levels of service parochialism. I would only offer as a contrast, in seemingly sort of undermining all known models of military bureaucratic politics. For 20 years, we have a Chinese military leadership largely made of Army personnel who nonetheless have decided to emphasize air and naval modernization, perhaps unprecedented in the history of civil military relations and military bureaucratic politics. We do not see the same selflessness, shall we say, on the Taiwan side in this respect. And it's often difficult, I think, in the context of our incomplete defense coordination and relationships sometimes to get past the fact that some of the requests reflect the personal desires of certain senior Taiwan military leaders rather than a comprehensive defense strategy that's understandable from the outside. In this respect, I applaud the QDR that Taiwan recently published and the efforts by others to come up with a more coordinated strategy. Clearly, defense coordination between the U.S. and Taiwan has been inconsistent and largely suboptimal, especially considering the real demands of coalition warfare. I mean, there's a, a la Rumsfeld and, coming with the Army you have. I mean, when you look and when you think about the dynamics of ad hoc coalition warfare between the U.S. and Taiwan in a contingency involving the PRC, there's an awful lot to be left to chance in that scenario, and that has always been frustrating to the participants. But at the same time, I would argue that intelligence and technology sharing with Taiwan has been impeded historically and increasingly by very serious counterintelligence concerns about PRC penetrations of Taiwan. And I think that that's an increasingly important factor that's being brought into concern about particularly some of the most advanced weapon systems that potentially could be transferred to Taiwan. Now, I won't personally make the mistake today of actually expressing any personal opinions on specific weapon systems or the porcupine strategy. But I would say that, feel free to try and nail me down in the Q&A. I think the Taiwan Relations Act and the U.S.-Taiwan defense relations, however, are going to be very different in this current period and moving forward. And I will take the less courageous low road of simply asking some provocative questions that for your consideration. One is, how do we actually continue defense cooperation with Taiwan, between the U.S. and Taiwan, in an environment of greater economic integration, especially given the security implications of some of the moves in the three links? The idea that we would have direct air travel between China and Taiwan, the access, therefore, to Taiwanese airports of PRC planes. I mean, there's a whole series of assumptions that went into defense planning before the three links that have to be fundamentally re-examined given the new avenues of approach that the three links potentially gives the Chinese military into Taiwanese airspace, into Taiwanese sea space. Second, and even more challenging, I didn't say any of this was going to be easy. How do we manage crises and escalation dominance in an environment in which we don't have trilateral fora between Beijing, Washington, and Taipei to actually deconflict, to set up rules of the road, to set up, we can't even set up incidents at sea protocols with China in an environment in which we've had a 2001 EP3 collision and the impeccable incident. Now imagine a scenario in which you're trying to manage that in a triangle. I mean, triangles are always unstable in strategic relations in the world, particularly ones in which there are not well-established communication mechanisms, but even bilaterally between elements of the triangle, much less trilaterally. In this respect, when I talk to senior policymakers about a Taiwan scenario, it's useful, I think, to note that I don't worry about the bolt out of the blue where the faceless Chinese leader is sitting stroking the white Persian cat in his lap in his floating volcano island headquarters, and he says, "Let's go," and everyone comes out of the caves and rolls. I worry much more about an accident, about a Taiwanese aircraft and a point in the X-shaped center line where they believe they're in Taiwanese airspace, but the Chinese don't, where they clip each other. Both sides rush search and rescue forces into a very small area. They're all painting each other with fire control radar. There's no escalation time. There's no confidence building measures. Then we get into the mix in a highly lethal, a surface-to-air missile environment. I mean, only bad things will happen in this kind of a scenario, and yet we are not anywhere near having the mechanisms to be able to manage that. Finally, and perhaps most troubling, how do we even make arms sales decisions in that kind of an environment of gradual rapprochement? Certainly, Washington supports the current progress that's been made in cross-strait relations. How do you find that golden balance where you can continue to make defensive arms sales to Taiwan and not impede progress? I mean, I think that, unfortunately, the news of the last couple of months has not been very promising because of the temper tantrums that the Chinese side has been throwing about the latest arms sales batch, and therefore their unwillingness to reestablish U.S. PRC mil-mil relations, which are fundamentally important for crisis management and escalation control and everything else. That move by the Chinese, in stark contrast to the rapprochement moves with the Taiwan side, suggests that there's going to be that kind of uneven play in this triangle, and I think that is going to be highly complicated to manage and presents a real challenge to incoming OSD policy personnel. And with that, let me stop.